Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Craig, we appreciate you taking some time to come talk to us again.
I'm glad to be with you. All you got to do is ask. I'm just sitting here doing nothing, waiting for somebody to ask me to do another podcast. So.
Just sitting around on his hands. Marcus says all we have to do is ask, but I think we've been asking for a few months.
Yeah, since about June.
And our listeners have been asking even longer than that to have him back on.
Yeah.
I don't understand, but I'm glad to be with you.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad to have you here.
I think a lot of our listeners have been following you around to other podcasts, so we got to get them back.
Mm-hmm. What is this, the third time we've had you on, maybe?
I believe that's right.
Maybe even fourth.
I'm not sure.
Getting up there. We'll have to send you a sticker kit. Some Wild Turkey Science stickers and a ball cap.
I bet he's been waiting on that.
Oh, I know. So what do y'all want to talk about today?
Well, we were kind of bouncing around some ideas, and I think we settled in on talking about fire and fire season in particular.
Right.
That's a fun topic.
Yeah, turkeys are the driving force here for why we're exploring that topic area. So we certainly will bring up turkeys, Will.
Yeah. Well, why don't we start out, Craig, if you don't mind, with kind of explaining how you set up the fire season study that you've been working on for the past several years, and then we can get into some of those results.
Yeah. Of course, I've been involved with fire research and, of course, using fire as a practice for many years. And the influence of when you burn on the plant community is of great interest to me. And my interest in that really started back in the early 2000s when we were doing some field work in John Gruchy's project. And we were looking at the effect of disking at different times and how that influenced the plant community with regard to different plant species germinating at different times, depending on when you disc. And I wondered, would we get the same response, some differing response if we burned at different times? And at that time, there was very little in the literature, next to nothing. Maybe one paper, as I remember, back in the 60s. I think, as I remember, in Arkansas or somewhere in the Ozarks, I believe, that had done a little bit of work with that, and they had found that there were some differences. And so we put in a field project where we looked at burning these old fields that were growing up in resprouting woody stems, sweet gum, green ash, red maple, etc. And we burned some during the dormant season, and then we burned other blocks of different fields in the late growing season. And it really just happened to be that we're trying to fit this in when we can. And so our fires were in September for the growing season. And lo and behold, it had an effect. The late growing season fire had far fewer resprouts coming back than the dormant season fire. And so I then established a study with the Tennessee Division of Forestry at Chuck Swan State Forest and Wildlife Management Area. And I think Marcus is well aware of this one as he had something to do with it. That was part of his master's project, where we were looking at the effect of early growing season fire repeated over time, because at that time, the thought was, once the leaves get to be about the size of a mouse's ear, you used to hear that you'd really have an effect on reducing the woody stems, the woody component. And what we found was the woody stems just kept regenerating, kept coming back. And I was kind of frustrated at that. And thinking back on John's work, we decided to put in treatments in new stands, different stands, and this started in 2011, whereby we were looking at the effect of early growing season fire implemented in April and May, with late growing season fire largely implemented in October, some in September, and I think one of the fires, because of the fire weather, wasn't really good, and it pushed into November, but essentially in October. And we're still running that project. And Mark Turner and Jake Bones and Spencer Marshall and I, we recently published a couple of papers from that in Fire Ecology, one looking at the differential effect on the plant community and wildlife use, in particular deer and turkeys, in those stands that had been burned now 6 times with late growing season fire and 6 times with early growing season fire in replicated treatments. And about 5 years ago, I wanted to do a more complete job with regard to looking at the effects of burning during the different times of the year. And so I worked with Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, Tennessee Valley Authority, the wildlife departments in South Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi. And we established 9 sites in those 4 states. And these sites were dominated either by loblolly or shortleaf pine. And as you know, across the South, there are, millions of acres covered in pines and a lot of acreage in loblolly pine that has been planted typically to grow fiber and make some money for the landowners, sometimes through conservation programs, sometimes not. But these stands, of course, are routinely thinned. You allow more sunlight in, and I would argue that as many, if not more, landowners now have wildlife as the prime objective as opposed to timber production. And so they're thinning these stands to allow more sunlight in and rejuvenate or increase understory growth. And typically that's for deer and turkeys, deer being the number 1, turkeys number 2, but more times than not, it's a co-objective, because you don't have to choose one or two.
Right.
You hunt deer in the fall and turkeys in the spring, so thank goodness we don't have to choose that. So anyway, they're doing it largely for deer and turkey hunting. And so my thought was, what effect is there on the plant community? How does that affect deer forage? How does it affect, obviously, then plant composition, which species of plants come back? How does that affect the structure? And the structure, it refers to the height and density of vegetation. And turkeys and deer both select different types of structure during different times of, the life cycle. Typically, fawns will be in more thick areas. More deer foraging typically will be in more open areas, especially where you have increased herbaceous plants and especially forbs. Turkeys typically like to brood in more open areas where visibility is good, yet cover is still good for the brood and for the hen, but she can, see up above it and have good visibility. But oftentimes where the turkey's nest is going to be in a little thicker cover, that visual obstruction is important, not only for selection, but also on survival of the nest and the hen. And so I wanted to see, can I manipulate the composition and structure by burning at different times? And so we designed a project where we have dormant season fire treatments early growing season fire treatments, mid growing season fire treatments, and late growing season fire treatments. And the dormant season is implemented January through March, and the early growing season in April and May, mid growing season in June and July, and late growing season in August through October. Though most of the late growing season fires are implemented in October because that's when it's typically driest and you get the best conditions. And so Jake Bones and Spencer Marshall have finished their theses on this project. Jake concentrating on the vegetation effects, and Spencer looking at the wildlife use because we have camera traps in all of these treatments. Each treatment is around 4 to 5 acres in size, and we have 4 camera traps in each. And we collect video on these camera traps, not still images. And what the video allows us to do is look at animal behavior, not just occupancy, whether they're there or not. So that's been a really interesting component of the study is to do that. And since Thomas Rovery and Maya Lapp have come on to the project, and that they are continuing that, our hope is to turn this into a long-term project. And both of you know this because you're both involved in the project. But that's the hope to continue looking at this because you don't change the world with 1 or 2 fires. And when you're looking at the differential effects of burning at different times of year, you will see some effect, and we have, and I know we'll get into it here after 1 or 2 fires, but really you're seeing that divergence in the plant community after several fires. And so I'm very interested, excited to see what change comes about after we've implemented these treatments, 6, 7, 8 times as opposed to 2. And so the results that we have thus far is based off of 2 iterations of fire. And of course, we have implemented these treatments on a 2-year fire return interval. I might back up and mention we also have fire treatments on the Bridgestone Firestone WMA, owned by the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency near Crossville, Tennessee, west of Crossville, Tennessee. And there we began what we have the prescribed fire demonstration area in 2011. And at that site, it was owned by a timber company until the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency purchased it in 1997, I believe it was. And until that time, it had been a loblolly pine stand, and the timber company liquidated the stand, clear-cut it, removed all the trees. And from 98 to 2010, TWRA had burned the entire area twice, according to record. The written record is a little sketchy, but from the manager that was there, from his recollection that they had burned it twice. Both fires had occurred during the dormant season. And so we set up the prescribed fire demonstration area such that we have about 15 to 30 acre treatment areas, and we have 6 of them. And 3 of them are burned during the early growing season, and 3 of them are burned during the late growing season. And in both, we have an annual fire treatment, a 2-year fire return interval in another one, and a 3-year fire return interval in another one. And so we have treatments that are looking at both frequency as well as season. And so we've, found some very interesting results in that we can get into. So that's kind of a background in most of the projects that we have that are looking at the effect of burning during different seasons.
Mm-hmm. One thing I want to go back and touch on real quickly is probably I think a lot of our listeners would be surprised to hear how little has been published on burning during such well-defined windows throughout the year. To be clearer about that, most of the papers that have come out about fire season at the most have just been comparing dormant versus growing season. And what they define as dormant versus growing season differs, from one paper to another. So I'm not aware of anything else that's been published at this fine of a temporal scale with regards to the season.
You're correct. Most of the studies that are looking at any differences in timing of fire concentrate on the difference between dormant season fire and growing season fire, and all but a couple, growing season fire means relatively early in April, May, and a few that go into June.
Right.
And there's a couple of others that have looked at the effects of dormant season fire versus late growing season fire. But until we began this project, there is no paper and no project that has, and I found this amazing, especially in the forestry literature, that looked at the
Right.
effect of dormant season fire versus early versus mid versus late, all in the same experimental design.
Right.
I know Tall Timbers now has a project that has all 4 seasons involved, but they did not start that until after we did. And as you know, Marcus, we tried to fit that into our project with Florida having a study site, but the timing was off. They were wanting to get theirs started in the middle of one of our iterations of treatment, and so it was kind of off, and so they are not included in our study. We still have the 9 sites in Tennessee, South Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi. But I'm glad they put that in. Obviously, that will be additional data, and they've published a couple of papers on that. I know, especially looking at the effects of insects and other invertebrates, pollinators, et cetera, and it'll be good information coming out of there as well.
My graduate student that was working in those plots just finished recently. Then we published one of her papers so far too. Yeah, that was pretty remarkable to me also, especially I think at the time there were maybe only 1 or 2 publications that had any kind of late season fire. When I was going through the literature looking for it,
Right.
I was trying to find a comparison to a September time frame, and it basically doesn't exist. So I'm with y'all. I think that's pretty remarkable. That to look at the fire window and even have really good data outlining what the fire window looks like, both from a historical perspective, but also just when there are good burn days.
Mm-hmm.
A fair number of historical fires and a fair amount of our burn window occurs in the fall, and to not have any data at that time is an oversight from my point of view.
And there's all kinds of things to consider. One is plant phenology and where you are on a latitudinal gradient in the country. Of course, it's greening up in Florida a lot earlier than it is in Pennsylvania. And so an April fire in Florida is well into the early portion of the growing season, whereas an April fire in especially early going into mid-April in Tennessee even, there's very little that has leafed out, especially of trees and warm season herbaceous plants. And of course, it's still into solid winter as you go farther north into Pennsylvania, New York, et cetera. So that's one thing, the plant phenology. And I remember looking at the data from Florida with an early growing season fire in April, May, and then thinking, okay, how long has the plant community greened up versus us if we burn in late April or early May, and the plants obviously are much younger. And that's one thing certainly worthy of consideration when you're looking at the results of studies. Where were they conducted, and think about the plant phenology, not just the month in which they burned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you get into, coastal Alabama, deep South Georgia, Florida Panhandle, and I mean, there's some years where you almost don't even have a true dormant season, right? Like,
Mhm.
I mean, things can stay green year round. So that makes a lot of sense. But I think before we get into the results, unless you want to go a different direction, Marcus, I was thinking, one of the things that has been most interesting to me participating in this particular project is learning about the fire weather and fire behavior during these different seasons. And it makes sense that there's been a lot of literature that's investigated that dormant and early growing season, and then a little bit more in the fall window. Um, but I was kind of surprised when I started burning some of the plots here in Alabama to see that, of course, what dormant season fire is going to be like, right? But then getting into the later portion, even of the early growing season, and sometimes even into early June, you still had some pretty good burn days. But then you get into like, mid to late June, and then especially July, and it's almost impossible sometimes in certain years to find a good burn day. Um, any other observations from y'all on just the application of fire during those different windows that managers might find useful?
Well, one thing that I would say is that in general, what you just said is true. However, it seems just about every year there's going to be a week or two, sometimes more, whether it be in June, July, or August, that there's going to be a dry spell. And
Hmm.
so you need to be ready to take advantage of that.
Right.
Again, on average, the uh, the fuel moisture, the humidity, the amount of rainfall we get, in our area of the country, it's wet and relatively
Hmm.
speaking. And you have, of course, uh, and we'll get into this, the shade of the trees. And
Hmm.
the shade of the trees or of cloud cover are very, very strong in dampening the fire intensity. I mean,
Hmm.
you can be burning on a day that's partly cloudy, and you see a certain fire intensity when the sun is shaded by the clouds, and as soon as the clouds move out and that direct sun hits, you see an immediate increase in fire intensity. And the same thing is true when you're burning in woods, whether pine or hardwoods that you have thinned. And so you can
Hmm.
expect a very different intensity on a given day if you're burning in a closed canopy stand versus one in which you have 20 to 30% sunlight versus one that you have 50% sunlight versus 75, or you get out of the woods into a field or all of the trees have been cut and you have 100% sunlight. And so
Right.
within a given condition, you can have uh, extremely different fire intensity based on either leaf cover or cloud cover. And then, of course, you haven't even uh, mentioned the humidity and the wind, etc.
Hmm.
And so, what I try to get across to people, something that I'm very interested in, is being much more precise in my fire application and the intended effect and outcome rather than, blunt force trauma, so to speak, of fire is good for wildlife. Fire
Hmm.
can be very good for wildlife. Fire can be bad. Fire can be not so good. And so it's all according to how you use it. There are three factors that generally are considered with regard to fire effects. And, there's discussion about which one is most important. But in general, we talk about fire intensity, we talk about fire frequency, and we talk about the season of burning. And we could argue whether intensity or frequency is more important, but certainly both of those will have a larger effect than your season of burn. But a fourth one that I have begun to list when I talk to folks and write things about fire effects is available sunlight. And, in all of these areas that we burn, we measure both the fire temperature, the intensity of the fire, as well as the amount of sunlight, available sunlight, that photosynthetic active radiation that we collect with septometers. And, these are electronic devices that we carry through the area, of course, prior to burning, and we know precisely how much sunlight on average is available in that stand or across that field or whatever it may be. And you can expect very real differences in plant composition that responds to fire based on how much sunlight there is, because plants need three things in order to grow: that's sunlight, nutrients, and water. And when you strongly affect the amount of sunlight, whether through retaining however many trees to allow a certain amount of sunlight to come in, and I might be getting ahead of myself, but in general, the plants that you're finding in a closed canopy stand, and even going up to 30 to 40% sunlight, those are either shade tolerant or moderately shade tolerant. And those are different species than what you will find in a stand that has 75% sunlight, and versus when you go out out of the woods into a field. And so out there you're going to have shade intolerant species, those that have to have a lot of sun. And so what you can expect germinating from the seed bank in these stands that you're burning is going to be strongly influenced by how much sunlight is coming in.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, canopy cover certainly influences everything in response to fire. I mean, burning a closed canopy versus a field, if you have a closed canopy, then I've done this for various reasons, but you burn under it and you're basically just consuming some leaf litter. And you may top kill a couple of shade tolerant, saplings in the understory, and then they sprout back. But other than that, there's not really much of an effect. So I often teach that to my class, that it doesn't, all these other things related to frequency and season and everything like that don't really matter if you don't have adequate sunlight to stimulate the understory response that you're looking for.
And that can't be the limiting resource.
Another factor that influences the plants is the moisture regime. And so if you're on a south-facing slope, you're going to have a different plant community than if you're in the bottom that is largely shaded and has a lot of moisture. And so you can go into a closed canopy stand that's along a creek bottom, and you may have near 100% coverage of herbaceous species, but those largely will be shade-tolerant grasses. Those will be shade-tolerant sedges and various forbs that really are later successional, as opposed to early successional plants that are responding to disturbance on drier sites and with more sunlight. Typically, when you go into a closed canopy stand, or you don't have at least 20% sunlight coming through, you will get very little plant response after you burn in that stand, if you're using low intensity fire and you're not harming the overstory trees. However, we have sites here in Tennessee where the canopy has not been disturbed, and in those situations, if you still have an intact mid-story, almost always you're going to be looking at 2 to 5% sunlight in those stands. If you burn with low intensity fire, over time, and it might happen in 1 or 2 fires, it might be 3 to 5 fires, you're going to eliminate the mid-story. Those mid-story stems will eventually be knocked out. And when you eliminate the mid-story, but you still have the intact overstory, on average, you're then going to have about 15% sunlight coming in. If you continue that low-intensity fire, literally over 20 to 25 years, and you're burning annually, every year you're burning, and we have sites that's been burned, I think, 22 or 23 years in a row with dormant season, low-intensity fire. You walk in there and you got big trees. It's a shaded environment underneath that's very open, but there's around 60 to 80% coverage of herbaceous species, but those largely are going to be sedges and shade-tolerant grasses and just a few forbs. The forb community there in general is going to be not that much. Hardly ever in those situations do we see any more than maybe 20% forb coverage. But there are some other shade-tolerant plants that eventually will be colonized and that you can find in those stands.
Mm-hmm. So probably not a lot of forage production for turkeys in those areas, but at
No.
least you have added some structure as opposed to an unburned closed canopy forest.
Some, but not that much because
Right.
of the shade, the
Right.
height of the plants are, and think of it also, you're burning every year, and so
Yeah.
you don't see a development of woody stems. The height of the understory is typically, even once you get into midsummer, typically it's less than knee high even.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm picturing like spike uniola grass
Yeah.
and like things like
Slender wood
St.
oaks,
John's wort,
chasmanthiums, etc.
slender wood. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
So, Craig, in that situation, are you seeing turkeys using those stands?
Yeah, but for
So what
they
are they
might
using
be
it for?
they might be loafing in those areas in places. There may be certainly sufficient cover for brooding, and especially in areas where you might have some downfalls or some type of structure, you might find some nest in there, and you can find a turkey nest just about anywhere. But more often than not,
Sure.
they're searching for that structure that helps them hide a little better.
Y'all want to jump into the results, the different seasons?
Yeah, I was going to say it's a time for us to go into some specifics on results.
Yeah, we don't, I think we've made everybody wait long enough already.
Well, I guess I'll start with the sites through Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina, and this is from Jake Bones' thesis, and we're about to submit some papers right now. I think both of his chapters are very interesting. But keep in mind, this is after only 2 iterations of the treatment. But in general, and trying to keep this as simplified as possible, we're seeing the best response by forbs in the late growing season treatment and in the dormant season treatment. And you think about it, and it kind of makes sense. If you're burning a plant while it is actively growing, you're going to set it back, right? I mean, that's not revelation.
Mm-hmm.
And most of these plants are going to be perennial plants, and they're coming back from a root system. However, if you're burning after those plants have matured and produced seed, then you're removing competition and you're allowing them to colonize and spread even more. And so I think it makes perfect sense that when you burn in the late growing season, and as I mentioned, most of our late growing season fires are in October, and these warm season forbs that you're finding in forested or woodland conditions during that time are warm season species, and we're seeing them increase when compared to control and when compared to pre-treatment levels more in the late growing season fire and in the dormant season fire as opposed to early growing season or mid growing season. However,
Mm-hmm.
more of the woody sprouts or more of the woody stems are resprouting after being top killed in the dormant season treatment than in the others. And in that study, what we've seen is a reduction in all woody stems across all growing season fire treatments, which is not surprising, and that has been established in the literature. However, the late growing season fire has less coverage of those species, and especially less than the dormant season. And also, when you burn in the dormant season, you get a strong response from the C4 grasses, and those grasses are the ones that have a different photosynthetic pathway. Many of these, all of those are warm season grasses that we commonly see, whether it's broom sedge or little blue stem. Those are some of the primary 2 species. And so we see them increase strongly with the dormant season fire, which makes perfect sense because you're consuming fuels and setting back competition right at the time when those grasses are about to sprout back from the root system. And so by the second year after fire, you're seeing a reduction in the forb coverage because of competition from the woody sprouts and the grasses. Whereas following the late growing season fire, we're seeing a better and more even spread even in that second year after fire than in the dormant season. And so, in a nutshell, if I'm wanting to increase the amount of forb coverage, I'm going to be doing some of my burning, and I'm not saying anyone should ever do all of their burning at any season of the year, but I'm going to be doing some of my burning during the latter portion of the growing season, or in fall, going into October, November. That's going to give you a better coverage of forbs on average than the others. This is not a world of difference. We're talking about percentage points, and on average, when we have in that neighborhood of 30 to 40% sunlight coming into the forest floor, you can expect not quite that much forb coverage, after a couple of fires, but it's approaching it. If you can match your amount of forb coverage with the amount of sunlight coming in, it's not exact, but it's interesting at how close that is. Usually, the amount of sunlight that you have is a little bit greater than the percentage of forb cover that you can expect.
Mm-hmm.
With regard to the woody resprouts, and this is from data that I haven't mentioned yet, but one thing Thomas and Maya have done is I think we have near 1,000 trees tagged with metal tags. That's a lot of work. And so these are mid-story stems that are at least 4.5 to 5 feet tall, and they vary in diameter from 1 to 3 inches. And of course, we're marking as many species as possible to try and detect a species effect. And this is very preliminary, okay? So take this with a grain of salt and don't count on this, write it down, whatever, but I'm just giving you some, update on what we're seeing. After a couple of fire events and looking at this over 2 years, virtually all of the stems that are top killed by dormant season fire are resprouting, like 97, 98%. With the early growing season fire and with the mid growing season fire, and this is, of course, just looking at the stems that were top killed. You don't tally the ones that, we're noting if the stem was not top killed or not, but we're not counting those that were not top killed. But if it was top killed, it has to be top killed in order to resprout, right? And so of those that are top killed during the early and mid portions of the growing season, we're seeing in the low 90%, somewhere, 92, 93, something like that, percent of those resprouting. In the late growing season fire, and this is just an average as of now, we're not anywhere near done with this, but preliminarily, we're seeing 75% of the stems that were top killed during the late growing season fire resprout. And so again, most of these are going to resprout regardless of when you burn, but if you can realize a 15 to 20 percentage point difference by burning in September through early November, for example, as opposed to burning in April, May. And I'm not saying this would hold true in all sections of the country, but here where we are with the species that we have, that's what we're seeing. And over a period of time, if you're burning, for example, on a 2-year fire return interval, you can make a bigger difference quicker by realizing that much better setback on those woody species as opposed to burning in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a substantial difference, especially after only a couple fires.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
but just think about that over the course of 10 or 15 iterations.
Well, we have near that at the Bridgestone Firestone Fire Demonstration Area. Now, we don't have all seasons there. It's just early and late. But what we see there is in the early 2-year fire return interval. So it's burned every 2 years in April after leaf out.
Mm-hmm.
It is a sea of broom sedge, little blue stem, bushy blue stem, etc. Decent forb coverage, but it's a sea of grass. If you turn around on the fire break and look on the other side at the late growing season every 2-year fire return interval, you see a better complement of forbs. You see far less native warm season grass, but also depending on the intensity of the last burn, you might see more woody stuff if the burn was not hot enough, if the intensity was not great enough to kill it. And so on average, we get greater intensity consistently with the dormant season fire than any other fire treatment. We get better, higher intensity with early growing season fire on average than mid and late. And we get a little better fire intensity. Well, we do get better fire intensity on average with the late growing season fire than the mid growing season fire. We have realized the fire intensity during the middle portion of the growing season on average is the least. But that doesn't mean you can't get a highly intensive fire in June or July. You know, that's totally dependent upon the conditions. But what I'm telling you is on average, if you're trying to burn in June and July at our latitude and in the plant communities that we're working in, your fire intensity, at least what we've measured, has been less during that time of year than the others. And the point I was going to make, when you compare the plant community in the 1-year fire return interval, 2-year fire return interval, and 3-year fire return interval at Bridgestone, you essentially lose your effect of season of burning when you stretch your fire return interval out to 3 years. Mm-hmm. If you're not burning every year or every 2 years, you're going to lose that seasonal effect because the trees are taking over. Yeah. You can look at the 2-year fire return interval, turn around on the fire break and look on the other side at the 3-year fire return interval, and it's a woody thicket. And so then we're talking about trees and shrubs, the resprouting trees in 3 years' time, and it's according to the site, but you're talking about stems that are anywhere from 1 to 2.5 or 3 inches in diameter, according to the site quality and the species. And so then you have to have a much more intensive fire to set back and top kill all of those stems and maintain a true early successional community. And an early successional community, as you know, is one that is dominated by shade-intolerant herbaceous plants. And when you have a 3-year fire return interval and you have all of these resprouting woody stems, and some of them are getting to 2 or 3 inches, and some of them might be in a spot where there might have been more fuel moisture or shade or something, and fire intensity was not great enough to top kill them, then they're going to be 6 years old because they weren't top killed by the time you burn the next time. And then you're trying to kill stems, top kill stems that are 6 years since they've been set back. That also means their root system is getting larger and larger and stronger with more and more carbohydrates and stored energy. And it's going to take even longer with regard to the number of successive fires to set that back, even if you go to a quicker fire return interval. So all of these things are related. Your fire frequency, the intensity, your season of burn, of course, the conditions in which you're burning, and the amount of sunlight that's coming in. And understanding how all of those work together can really help you to implement your fire much, much more precisely to achieve the desired outcome, what you're looking to do.
Mm-hmm. So Craig, what you're saying is if you're only burning every 3 years or even less often than that moving around the season to try to combat woody stems is probably not going to help you a lot.
That's correct.
Yeah.
If you're burning
Okay.
in October and you're only burning every 3 years, you are going to have, with the exception of very poor sites. You can go
Right.
to a area that is strongly, a sandy soil, well drained. Your succession is going to be much slower on that site than a clay or loam that's got better moisture. But on average, across most of these sites in the eastern U.S., where you have 45 plus inches of rain a year, and especially with loam to clay soils, if you're burning on a 3-year fire return interval, you have a woody plant dominated community, period.
Right.
Now,
Right.
if you burn hot and you top kill all that, you're going to get a great flush of forbs and grasses coming back, but you're also going to get a great flush of all those woody stems. And within that very year, most of them are going to resprout anyway. They're just going to get larger and larger. They're going to overly compete with the herbaceous plants, and you have a woody plant dominated community, which means by definition, you then are into a mid-successional stage.
Yeah. Yeah. And that stand you just described is probably not going to get a lot of interior use by turkeys.
I would argue that that's the size of the stand, and that's another conversation to talk about
Right.
the scale of management. How large of an area do I want to burn, and maintaining my property in different vegetation types and different age stands, different structure, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Craig, I think I'd like to get into that a little bit, but I was wondering, I was thinking through what you're talking about. It's a really interesting study, and that right in the peak of my interest as well. So I'm sitting here listening to you. You talked about having use data. So can you tell us a little bit about how turkeys were using these different treatments, and then I also think it would be really interesting if you could talk us through the fire cycle and what you'd be using the different times of fire and what you would expect turkeys to be using it for in different parts of that cycle.
Well, in the Chuck's One study that we just published, as I mentioned, on average, we had more intense fires in the early growing season treatment than in the late growing season treatment. And that affected the structure. And so the structure of the plant community in the early growing season units was more open than that in the late growing season units. Now they were both open, no mid-story, but the structure of the understory was greater in the late growing season, because think about this. If you burn in September, October, early November, well, you're not going to get much, if any, plant growth back after that before, temperatures are such that, you're not getting much of a green up. And so that area is going to green up the following spring. And so if you're using early growing season fire, then by default, you're allowing the leaves to come onto the trees. The energy is coming up from the root system, and they're all leafed out, whether it's herbaceous species or whether it's sprouts of brambles or sprouts of shrubs or sprouts of trees. And so they've put a lot of energy in that to get their leaves expanded, and you're burning then, and that's setting them back. All right, let's say you are 3 weeks into spring when you burn, and you just set it all back. Now it's brown out there, or consumed, if you had intensity enough to actually consume the plants. But most of the time, it's going to be browned out and they're top killed.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be another 3, or maybe in some sites even 3 weeks or longer before those plants come back to where they were when you burned. And so what you just did, effectively, you have set this back about 6 weeks.
Right.
That's roughly a month and a half. And so that has strong effects on the structure that a hen would look for to take a brood and how much cover there is in that stand for the brood versus the cover that would be in a stand that was burned the prior March, and it has not been set back while it's growing. And so your structure is going to be taller in the stands that were burned in March the following spring, summer, than in those stands that you burned it that spring, after everything had greened up. Turkeys respond very strongly to visibility. And what we found via the camera traps was that turkey use in those stands was greater through the summer following an early growing season fire versus a late growing season fire because of the taller structure that we recorded in the stands that were burned during the latter portion of the growing season.
Okay.
Now, earlier in the spring, obviously you would expect more use in the late growing season treatments because there is cover. In the early growing season, if you just burn it, there's not going to be any cover. Now, there may be foods available, after you consume the leaf litter and seeds and mast and whatnot, even, crispy fried insects and whatnot that they will come through and use. Certainly, turkeys use areas immediately after burning, but in general, with a little more plant cover, you could expect some increased use. But through the spring and summer, they respond to that structure, and were in those stands that were burned during the early portion of the growing season more so than the prior late portion of the growing season.
Mm-hmm.
And so then to answer the second part of your question, Marcus, I'm just thinking of what I need across a property, and I'm trying to keep my scale of burning low. No study has found that fire during any time of the year consumes nests to a point that you would affect the population. However, as you well know, at Fort Bragg, for example, depending on your extent of burning and when you're burning it, you can influence the structure of the plant community. And so at Fort Bragg, as you well know, what we found was the turkeys were strongly selecting those drainages that had better vegetation structure than the uplands, which was sandy soils, low wiregrass, very little, forb community, et cetera, and nowhere near the structure that a hen might search for with regard to visual obstruction for her nest. And so, we recorded, a few nests that were consumed, but that would not have been to the extent that you would expect a population decline. So if you go into an area that is of clay, loam soils, and you would expect better and more growth, no, I'm not worried that I'm going to consume all the nests, but I'm not going to be burning, if I'm managing my property for turkeys, I'm not going to be burning 100 acres during the nesting season. That's kind of dumb to me. I'm going to have my scale smaller than that, and I'm going to move my burn units around, and I'm going to have a better diversity of structure and plant composition that turkeys can use and other wildlife, especially deer, through the year. And so the areas where I'm wanting to disperse and distribute brooding cover, I'm going to be burning those every 1 to 2 years, very frequently. And then some smaller areas where I might want a little more structure, I'm going to be burning those either every 2 or 3 years. And if I wait and burn 3 years, I might switch and burn those more frequently for a few years. So it's all according to the plant response. And that changes depending on how much shade you have. And if you have a considerable amount of shade, then you can get by with burning less frequently and have a certain height of vegetation, as opposed to if the stand was open up and you've got, 60 to 70% sunlight coming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that
And
makes sense.
let me back up there. When I'm talking about burning 100 acres, look, I realize the limitations, and especially of large properties, and they're wanting to implement a lot of fire, and obviously on state and federal owned lands where manpower is limited, time and money often limited, and they're burning larger acreages. But let's also think about objectives. If your objective is to maintain an ecosystem, the longleaf pine ecosystem, or an open oak pine woodland, then it makes sense to burn larger areas, and you're kind of allowing the wildlife species to fall in as and respond as they may. That's very different
Mm-hmm.
than if I'm managing my 80 acres or my 800 acres or my 5,000 acres specifically for wild turkeys. Then I'm going to have a different burning regime, and I'm not going to be burning 1 to 200 acres at the time. I'm going to tighten that scale down, and I'm going to provide that better across the property, and intersperse these different times of fire during the season, and fire frequency across the property.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Craig, one of the other things I wanted to ask about is how you use this information related to the effects of burning during different seasons on vegetation responses to tackle, common management issues that you typically run into on a property. Like, for example, maybe one that would be a good starting point is one that a lot of landowners in the deep south deal with, where they've got a stand. Maybe they haven't burned it in a while, or maybe they have been burning it, but it's been fairly irregular or long intervals, and now they've got a sea of sweet gum in the understory. So, using the information that y'all have gained from this study, how would you start tackling an issue like that?
Well, that's very common, and you go to those properties and they'll say, yeah, we tried burning in the growing season, but look, we just get sweet gum.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and especially once that sweet gum gets of a certain age and you got a root collar that's 3 or 4 inches in diameter, etc., there's a lot of energy in there. And as I mentioned, that's going to continue resprouting regardless of when you burn. But again, if you start burning on a shorter rotation and you move that fire later into late summer, fall, you're going to get a little better control.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're waiting, as I mentioned, 3 years, or the old recommendation for a fire return interval is like 3 to 5 years.
Right.
If you wait 3 to 5 years to burn, buddy, you're in a woody thicket.
Yeah.
on most sides. That's all there is to it.
Right.
But of course, the best approach in the example that you just provided is to couple your fire with an herbicide application. And so
Sure.
that's what I would prescribe in that situation, is to
Right.
implement an herbicide application, let's say in the deep south in late May through June, and let that brown out, and then follow that with a fire later in July through mid-August, and you're going to be on your way to fixing the situation. Now, let me mention this. What do you think is going to happen if you do that, but yet there are 14-inch DBH sweet gums in the next stand?
You're going to seed in.
It's just raining down seed every year. And so
Right.
you got to go kill the mama trees. You got to get into the wind shed of what's blowing into that stand, and kill the mature sweet gums that are blowing seed every year into the area that you're trying to manage. And I don't say that flippantly. I routinely visit properties and talk with the landowners. I'm trying to manage this field down here in this bottom, and I got to do something with it every year. Yeah, you do. You know why? Because there's green ash, there's sycamore, there's sweet gum all along that creek, and it's just raining the seed down into this field, and they're germinating, growing every single year. And so, a bottomland site is obviously the most difficult site of all to maintain an early successional community, because it is just screaming to be forest.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to try to do that, you got to get into those drainage areas and girdle and kill all of these problematic trees that are raining the seed in. You can leave the ones that are not a problem, of course, but you're going to have to reach into the woods, a good 50 to 100 yards at least, and kill those problematic trees and leave them standing. Woodpeckers and all kinds of other critters need that dead wood. I would argue that there's no single feature that probably has given rise to increased diversity of wildlife more than both standing and down dead wood. So don't worry about it. You might not want to get heavy equipment in there to do logging on those sites, but that doesn't mean you can't take a chainsaw and girdle the trees and leave them standing.
Mhm.
Girdle and spray. Don't girdle
Right.
and then quit. You need to spray that wound in order to kill it.
Are there any other problems that you see really commonly, Craig, like that you try to get people to tweak the timing of fire to address?
Well, as I mentioned, with regard to brooding and as well as deer forage, I'm trying to burn those sites every year, and at least every other year. And what Spencer found in his data is that, and Thomas in another data set, is that fawns are strongly associated with these thicker sites. And so that stem density is very important for fawn cover. We also are seeing a significant reduction in coyote occupancy with regard to the structure. They typically are in these more open areas. The fawns are in the thicker areas. The bucks are in the more open areas for forage, and the does, it's just fascinating to see, they are spending their time between both the thick, where the fawns are, and the opening, where they're trying to get more and better forage. And I know this is the turkey podcast, but I think a lot of people would be interested in this, in that they're trying to manage their property for both turkeys and deer. And so I would go with a longer fire return interval to maintain deer bedding cover in particular, because there you're wanting to see more of those stems, a greater stem density, but also the greater the stem density, you may see some problems with regard to turkeys nesting in those areas, possibly increased hen mortality, but the visual obstruction typically leads to better survival of the nest. So having some of all of these types of cover is going to be beneficial if you're managing for both of those species, because they need a different plant community and structure during different times of the year for different needs.
So we land on diversity again.
Well, it's
Like
simply
usual.
it's simply true. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But I will also say this: if you're managing specifically for turkeys, more likely than not, you really need to disturb the area much more frequently than what we have previously done. And I'm saying,
agree with
if
that.
I'm managing my property for turkeys, I'm burning on a 1 to 2 fire return interval, and I will have some little areas, smaller areas, where I might not be burning as frequently, but I'm meshing that around everywhere. And it's a big difference whether you're in a hardwood system or a pine system.
Sure.
In lots of areas of pine systems, you don't have that much topography. And so then you're looking at managing different blocks, whether it be based on drainages or roads or what have you, and burning them and disturbing them on a little different regime to have that diversity. In hardwood systems, and in particular where you have topography, those are the very best, because then you're going to have a different plant community on north aspects versus south aspects. That has everything to do with my fire regime, how often I'm burning, how much sunlight I'm allowing into those areas. There's a lot to be said, I think, about having areas that are fairly open for turkeys to spend time loafing, and deer will do the same thing, especially during the summertime. It's 95 degrees, and having some of those open spots where you're getting a little more airflow and it's cooler. You're looking at a difference of 15 degrees ambient temperature in those spots versus being out in the middle of a field with direct sunlight coming in on you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so you need it all. You don't want just one aspect of it.
Yeah, not all stands need to be thinned to allow 50% sunlight and burn them every October, every 2 years. No, you need much more diversity than that.
Right. That makes sense.
But in general, you need to burn a lot more frequently than what we have traditionally in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah, that happens. That low basal area condition with frequent fire usually is what's missing.
Yeah, that's right.
And for those managing pines, and this is not a revelation, what our data are showing, if you don't have a minimum of 50% sunlight, and more often than not, with regard to a basal area, you're talking about a basal area of 40 square feet per acre, you're probably not going to have greater than 30% coverage of forbs. But if you can get to 50 plus, and get that basal area down to at least 40 and really below, then you can really start seeing an explosion in the forb cover. And that has everything to do with good brooding cover. That has everything to do with insects, with nutritional carrying capacity for deer. The forbs are really a driver with regard to productivity.
Yeah. When you get down to those lower basal areas, Craig, do you ever feel like with that high sunlight availability that you have to fight grass a little bit more from taking over?
I think that is very much associated to your timing of burning. If you,
Yeah.
pick,
Here we are.
Did you listen to what he said, Will?
I did. I was wanting him to bring in the seasonality aspect there. I was trying to walk him back into it directly.
Pick a quail plantation in the South, that has been going for many decades. And of course, not all of them, and there's many of them that are extremely well managed.
Yeah.
And have got some extremely good managers. But historically, you're talking about sites that do all of their burning in March.
Yep.
And they do all of their burning in March because you know what happens on February 28th.
Mm-hmm.
The quail season ends. And you know what happens historically around the last week of March.
Turkey season starts.
And so you got to get all of your burning done in March. And when you do that, and a lot of these places are burning annually, a lot of them at least every other year. When you do that, and you do that for 20 to 30 years, you have sparse pine trees and a sea of warm season grasses underneath.
Yeah.
And you wonder why you need to consider a feed trail for your birds. Because you've lost your food plants because of chronically burning during the time that is promoting these deep rooted grasses that are growing up and out competing other plants.
Right.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So you're going to have to diversify when you burn it, mix in some late growing season with that.
At least into the growing season, July, August, et cetera, not just in March.
Yeah, right.
And one other thing I wanted to point out that I forgot earlier, I was trying to get to, is in the Pine Belt in the Deep South along the coastal plain. Marcus alluded to this. Historically, lightning caused most of those fires, and
Right.
lightning caused most of those fires in May, June, July, and going in later into the summer. But most of them was kind of earlier in the summer. Once you come up into the Piedmont and the upper coastal plain and into the Mid-South and the Central Hardwoods region, dendrochronological evidence tells us most fires occurred during the dormant season and during the late portion of the growing season, and specifically in fall. And that was done by humans, not by lightning. Most of the fires, once you get up out of the coastal plain, was ignited by humans historically, not lightning. And so you think about that, and think about the plant communities that have come about over time, and I think it begins to make a lot more sense.
Absolutely.
The fine fuels in the pines are not present in those flat leaves of hardwoods, and it makes a very real difference with regard to fuel moisture and your availability to burn.
Right.
And fire intensity.
Good stuff.
Indeed. Well, Craig, we've been going on for more than an hour. Is there anything else that we haven't asked you about that you think you want folks to know?
I imagine that's plenty to listen to. People probably turned off already, gotten bored, but hopefully they picked up a couple things they might be able to
I doubt it.
use.
I think you'll have many people listening to this one more than once, and probably self-included.
Well,
yeah, I'll include me in that one.
we're going to be getting some papers out, and some extension information that'll be easily available. All those papers are available on my webpage. Not that I necessarily check that, and I certainly do not count hits. I don't even know how to do that, but they're there, offered for people if they want. But we'll be getting more information on these projects out very soon, and that's the purpose of this, is to hopefully help people and help them reach their objectives more successfully and easily.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad you're doing it, and I can say that it certainly has helped me and inform what I recommend to folks that I talk to.
Absolutely. Yeah, we, like always, we will try to link everything you've talked about in the show notes, make it easy on folks, including your website, so they can find some of your other information, because I know you have a lot of great stuff for land managers.
Well, very good, guys. I hope you're getting over that cough soon, Marcus. And Will,
I'm working hard on it.
Will, buddy, I hate to tell you, but all those aches and pains are just going to increase now that you've turned 40 today.
Well, there's no two guys I'd rather spend it with. So
yeah, well.
Well, I hope you'd rather spend it with Neva, so you better be getting home and.
Well, you notice I said guys. I qualified it by saying guys there. So.
I noticed and appreciated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Will turned 40 today, everybody, if you didn't pick up on that. So happy birthday, Will.
Does that mean I get to apply for senior citizen hunts now?
You're getting closer.
Something like that. I think you get to park up front at the grocery stores, what it means.
Oh, man. I'm all about that.
Or the drugstore. You'll be going to the drugstore for those aches and pain medications more than the grocery store.
Yeah. All right. Well, Craig, it's always a pleasure. Really enjoyed talking through all that with you and listening to all the cool results coming out.
Oh, yeah.
So thanks for taking
enjoy
the time to do it.
Y'all keep up the good work of sharing all this information.
Yeah.
Yep, that's what we plan to do. Thanks, Craig.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks everybody out there for listening.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.